Shelly has brought a number of radiation monitors, which are here today. We'll put them at the back of the room later if you'd like to have a look at them. So we've invited Shelly to come and talk about radioactive materials because as a scientist and someone working in radiation protection, she actually really knows what she's talking about. Whereas I feel that in the visual arts, we're often reading the secondary, tertiary literature and information, and there's a huge spectrum of debates around radiation protection and radioactive materials, and Shelly will be able to tell us about her work and some of her knowledge today.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. I have to admit that as a scientist standing up and talking about radioactive materials to a load of artists, says she, is a bit sort of awe-inspiring, and I'm not quite sure where to start and how to finish and all that kind of stuff. I thought I was going to be the only scientist here, but I'm pleased to hear at least there's one other physicist. Maybe there are other people with science. Anybody with science background? Yes. We're not that weird. We are real people, and I think that is part of it. We're all part of society, and that's very important. Now, this is going to be an interesting logistical thing because I've got lots of slides, and right, let's go for the next one. Right, so radioactive materials is just a huge subject, and I could talk about it for days. But I'm only allowed half an hour, so I'm going to whistle through and try and pick out some interesting things, and maybe we can have some discussions later on. So, I'm going to cover a little bit about radioactivity, just a quick reminder of what it's all about, and talk about radiation protection and radioactive waste disposal, which is the area that I'm interested in and why I think I was invited to come. Okay, right, who am I? Well, I'm a physicist. I studied physics at university. I then went on to do a master's in physics and archaeology at the Research Lab for Archaeology and the History of Art in Oxford. And that's where I started working with radioactivity, which you might think is a bit odd, but what I was doing was I was dating sediments and other materials, and that's what the Research Lab does. And to do that, we're looking at the effects of natural background radiation on artifacts and on sediments. And I was actually dealing with radioactive sources trying to induce the same effects by holding a radioactive source onto various items. So that's where I got introduced to radiation. Though I didn't know that at that time I was going to go on to do radiation protection as a career, which is what happened after that. I got a job with the then National Radiological Protection Board, and I was there for over 30 years. And then I finally branched out and went and joined a small consultancy company looking at nuclear waste, radioactive waste management, radioactively contaminated sites, and how to deal with that. So that's where I am. My main aspects for radiation protection have been looking at radioactive waste, how you deal with it, how do you make sure it's safe, and looking at contaminated land, radioactively contaminated land, how do you clean it up, what sort of levels are safe, and what do you do with the waste. Right, radioactivity, for those who can remember their GCSE, yes, you've got an atomic nucleus which has got little protons, and your neutrons in the middle, these jolly red and blue things, not really red and blue, but, and then you've got electrons orbiting round. And there are all sorts of debates about whether electrons, when they're orbiting around the nucleus, are particles or waves and all that kind of stuff. But that's serious physics, and we don't need to know that for the purposes of radiation protection or what we're talking about. Right, so basically, some atoms are not stable. They've got the wrong combination of neutrons and protons to survive like that for a very long time. So they decay. And you can decay by emission of what's known as an alpha particle or by a beta particle, and usually when that happens you get some gamma rays emitted at the same time. So the alpha particle is the heavy particle. Every time an alpha particle or a beta particle is emitted, the atom changes from one element to another. because the element is defined by the number of protons in the nucleus. So you are changing from one element to another. So this half the particles are heavy, relatively speaking, in terms of atoms, and they don't go very fast, so they're easily stopped. Betas are smaller, they're like the electrons. They come out from the nucleus, so you've either got a neutron changing to a proton, emitting an electron, and another tiny little thing called an antineutrino, or you've got a proton in the nucleus changing to a neutron, and you get out an anti-electron called a positron. So those are the sort of basic radioactive decay mechanisms. Okay. And then the gamma radiation, it's a bit like X-rays and light. It's got no mass or charge, and it can penetrate. It goes a long way. Okay. That's boring, but X-rays. These are usually come from the outer shell of the atom, from the electrons, and they're generated by machines. So X-ray machines in hospitals and things like that generate X-rays. You can switch them off. So, you know, when the machine is off, there's nothing being generated. Okay. Then there's the neutron, which is an interesting particle because it's got no charge, and so it can trundle through things and is very penetrating. You can slow it down by almost a sort of billiard ball kind of knocking it backs and forwards, and that's what they use in nuclear reactors. So next one. So what you've got is if you hit something like uranium or plutonium with a neutron, you can actually get that atom to split into two. And what happens when it splits, it releases another few neutrons. And if you can get that neutron to hit another atom of the uranium or the plutonium, then you get another split and another neutron, and you get a lot of energy every time the nucleus splits, and you get this sort of chain reaction. And that's what nuclear fission is all about. And if you control it, then you've got a reactor. If you don't, and you have it happen very fast, then you've got a bomb. And that's what it is. It's the sort of chain reaction. Okay. So simple thing for shielding from radiation. Alphas, they're stopped by a sheet of paper. Betas go a little bit further and stopped by aluminium. Gammas will go a bit further, and you can stop them by sheets of lead. And depending on the energy, you need different thicknesses of lead. And the golden rules of radiation protection are time, distance, and shielding. To protect yourself from radiation, reduce your time, increase your distance away, and put up some shielding. And so you juggle those different things to protect yourself. Okay. Radioactive decay. Has everybody heard about half-life? Some nods. Some people looking confused. But basically, this nucleus is unstable. You don't actually know when it's going to break up or emit. But you do know that after a period of time, when half of it will have gone and will have decayed. So that's called the half-life. So you can say, right, okay, at the beginning there was this much. Let's pick a number I can read. I can read 60. It's got down to 30 after approximately 2 days. So the half-life of that is about 2 days. So gradually it decreases. So after one half-life, you've only got half left. After 2 half-lives, you've got a quarter of what you started with. After 3 half-lives, you've got an eighth of what you started with. After 10 half-lives, you've not got much left at all. And this is the basis of radioactive decay and how we protect against radionuclides. You're looking at the half-life. How long do we have to wait before it's disappeared, basically, of its own accord? And it's quite clever. Radioactivity does go away. Some of it might take a bit of a long time, but it will vanish, while some other pollutants do not decay like this. Okay. Right. So you can have clever things where one radionuclide decays into another one. It's a very good diagram, I'm afraid, but you've got, this is natural thorium decay chain, and it trundles down all the way down here, and there's your stable lead at the bottom. So one radioactive one goes to another radioactive one, and they keep decaying down in the chain. That's called radioactive chain decay. And the naturally occurring radionuclides, uranium and thorium, have these decay chains, which is why we've still got them around. You get quite a mixture of radionuclides out in the world. Okay? Right. Radiation, it's not great for you, but on the other hand, you have to make sure that you keep things in perspective. So I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to say you need to think about it, but you know, radiation protection people like me do work at this and try and make sure that everything's okay. So what you've got is these alpha, beta and gamma radiations come out from the nucleus. They can actually damage living cells. And so the cell may then change, which is forming a cancer, or it may kill the cell. Now that might not be too bad a thing, but if you have too many cells dying, then that's obviously not good news for you. So it all depends on the level of exposure you get, the level of dose. Okay. Next one. So how do we know how dangerous it is? Well, there's lots of evidence out there. In fact, it's one of the most researched pollutants, and it's fairly easy to detect as well. So we've got lots of evidence from the atomic bomb survivors. We've got a lot of medical procedures where people have been given X-rays, been given various medical isotopes and stuff like that to ingest. They've had various doses. We've got records of workers in the nuclear industry. We know exactly what doses they get. We can look at what kind of diseases they get, if any, and we can work out the risks from a dose. So we can work out how dangerous it is on the basis of that. And people are continually doing it. This is called epidemiology, and this study is continually going on. There are reports out every couple of years about, do we still think it's this effect on people, this risky or not. So it's been going on for years. Okay. Right. So radiation protection, which is what I do, is to try and protect people from the harmful effects of radiation. Sorry, it's a boring slide. There are two types of effect. One is what they call the deterministic effects, which is essentially you're killing cells. You're getting quite a high dose. And things like reddening of the skin ulcers are deterministic effects. You can get that from holding a radioactive source, but don't do it. And the idea of radiation protection is there's a threshold for this, so if you can keep the dose below that threshold, then people won't get that effect. Simple, you prevent it. For other effects, which are known as the stochastic effects, you've got a chance of having one of those cells turning into a cancerous cell. If you get exposed, it may never change into a cancerous cell, and you might get away with it. But there is a chance that it turns into a cancerous cell. So what you do is you try and reduce the level of dose to as low as you can get it. But this is where this clever thing called a LARA comes in. As low as reasonably achievable, taking into account social and economic factors. And this is very important because the basis of radiation protection is a theory, and I have to say it is a theory, that the more the dose you get, the more the risk. So as you go down, there is a point where you get a very low dose, you get a very low risk. But to get zero risk, that's zero dose. And this is known as a hypothesis. We cannot prove, and we never ever will be able to prove it, but we know at the high dose end it works. At the low dose end, we just assume that the straight line still applies. And so that is what we have to say, well, we don't think there's a threshold below which there is no effect. We don't know that. There may be a threshold. There are people out there who say there is a small threshold, and a little bit of radiation is good for you. Don't worry about it, guys. Radiation protection says, well, we have to do the best we can. So we try and reduce the doses down as low as possible. But we take into account other factors like social and economic factors. So if it's a real hassle to reduce the dose a little bit, because you're going to have to move people out their houses and all that kind of stuff, well, actually, people might prefer to have that tiny risk rather than having enormous amount of disruption. And there's that sort of balancing out. Okay. So this is basically what I've been talking about. So radiation protection has two main principles, which is justification. If you're going to introduce a source of radiation, it has to do more good than harm overall in the big scheme of things. If you're going to actually go in and clean up an area, it has to do more good than harm in the grand scheme of things. And then, having decided that it will, you then try and do the best you can within the constraints of the money and the hassle and all the other environmental effects that your actions are going to take. So there's a lot of judgment that goes into radiation protection. And that is something that's quite difficult to communicate to people who are not in the radiation protection fraternity. Okay. How do we get exposed to radiation? You can either have external radiation from items outside of you, or if you eat something that's radioactively contaminated, or you breathe in radioactive dust, then you can get exposed inside. So those are the two main routes. And these are all sorts of things that we have to think about when we're trying to work out the environmental impacts of radioactive waste disposal or contaminated land. So we have to think about all this. Okay. So, just to remind you that the world is radioactive. And I could turn that detector on and it will go tick, quite a lot tick, just because we're in a building. It's part of the world. It's been around millions of years. We cannot escape it. It is there. We have got used to it, in a sense. It's there. Most people don't even think about it. The only thing you perhaps need to think about is radon. Has anybody heard about radon?
Yeah.
Because there are some areas in the country where there are higher levels of radon. And you're usually worried about radon in the house, because outside it disperses, but in the house it can sort of start to accumulate. It doesn't have a very long half-life, but it's being continually generated by the soil underneath. And so in some areas people have to increase the ventilation of their house. So there's a big campaign by Public Health England, as they're called now, HPA, that I used to work for, NRPB, and they produced this map of radon-type areas in the UK. They've done them for Scotland and whatever. So you can see the darker areas are where they expect people to have more radon in their homes than others. This is the equivalent for Europe, and you can see in the grand scale of things, the UK isn't particularly high. There are some areas in Europe that have much higher levels of radon. But the interesting thing is, if you look at lung cancer risks, the top two lines are for people who smoke, and the bottom two lines are for people who don't smoke or haven't smoked for 10 years. So smoking plus radon is bad news. So don't smoke, full stop. But yes, I mean, if you look at sort of deaths in the UK, then lung cancer from radon at home. I mean, it's not huge compared to all road accidents, but it's not trivial. So that is actually one of the public health campaigns that the Public Health England are looking at, is reducing radon in people's houses. So you can get a detector and work out your level of radon, and they'll give you advice. And to protect it, there's a whole document about how to do it, but you can seal your floor, or you can have a pump that sucks the radon out and just puts it into the atmosphere. Okay. We are surrounded by radioactive materials, and there's a bit of this nice radium glass out the back. People don't realise that new salt, which is low it's got potassium in it, which is naturally radioactive. So it is a radioactive material, which we are allowed to put on our food. So just the fact that it's radioactive doesn't mean that it's a problem. But just be aware that whenever you hear the word it's radioactive, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's that dangerous. It depends on what it is and the level that you've got. So, and one of the interesting things is, I was taking this detector around the house last night, as you do, just to see what sort of levels you get. And yes, you know, white sinks do give a higher level than just being in the house. And you know, do I worry about it? No. Red bricks give a slightly higher level, because I've got a pile of bricks out in the garden, and they're higher level than in the house. Outside in the garden is a lower level than in the house, because the building materials emit a little bit of radiation. Anyway, this is one of my pet hates, is people that sell items with the trefoil. Now this is a warning sign. Radiation trefoil is a warning that this is radioactive. I think this is very irresponsible. Unfortunately, it's not illegal. But you know, if I saw that, I would think that's a radioactive mug. And if you left this on a tube train or something like that, there will be an alert. They'll have the security forces out because they think that maybe there was a radioactive sign there, and they'd have to sort of, you know, evacuate and then clear it up and decide what was going on. So I think that's terribly irresponsible. Do not use a warning sign in a trivial situation. Okay, I'm going to have to whiz through. Let's go, because I've only got 5 minutes left. I haven't even got to the important bit yet. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Right. Okay. This is just a nice pretty picture to show there are lots of different types of detector. We can't detect radiation, but there are lots of machines we can build that will do it very easily. And that's one of the things. It is one of the most straightforward things to detect. Okay? I want to make the point here that if you're dealing with radioactive materials, radioactive waste in particular, you can't just say, well, here's a bit of radioactive waste, I'll just stuff it in the bin. I'll just throw it out and dig it in a hole in the ground. You have to have records, you have to go through a whole approvals process. It is highly regulated. You've got the regulators who are, you know, if you've got a waste site, I mean, the site that Ellie showed, low-level waste site, they have a permit from the Environment Agency to receive waste. They set waste acceptance criteria. They then check that whoever's sending them the waste meets that acceptance criteria, that they've got the records, they check the records to see what they think is in these waste drums and all that sort of stuff. So it's not just any old thing, it's almost dealt with like as a normal sort of commodity that you're selling, but it's just something that's really well controlled. You can't just check it out. Okay. So this is what I do, radiological assessments. Check the radionuclides, work out how they move in the environment, work out the doses to people, and then sort of say, is this a good solution or a bad solution? Okay. And these are the sorts of pathways that people I'm thinking about. People growing food in their gardens, and people sort of breathing in, messing about on beaches if they're contaminated beaches, all sorts of things that you have to think about, and you have to be quite creative sometimes to think about all the pathways whereby people could become exposed. Okay. Oh, it's all right. Don't worry. I mean, this is all just showing that to decide what to do about contaminated land or radioactive waste disposal, you go through a process of deciding on the optimum option. This is to do with this ALARA process I mentioned. So you have to think about all these factors. And that's what I mean by social and other factors. It's not just the dose to people and the price it's going to cost. There's all sorts of other things. What do people think? This is where everybody has a view. It's important that you talk to people and consult people, because people have valid views as to what they want to happen in their local environment and their local area. Okay. So this is just some pictures of radioactive waste. You've got drums and bags of not very radioactive waste. This is put into a drum, which is then squashed, and then it's grouted and put into a ISO container, basically, and disposed of. You've got some areas where you have to have remote handling. You've got other areas where this has got high-level waste underneath the floor, but the guy's standing on there because it's shielded. It's perfectly safe for him to stand above a store of high-level waste. Okay? There are various disposal options. So you've seen, this is the ISA containers, and that's the Drug site that Ellie showed. Slightly prettier picture of it. What they will do, once they finish disposing of all the stuff, is they'll cover it over with a mound of earth. Quite thick, several metres thick of earth and gravel and a sort of impermeable sort of liner over the top. So it won't look like that, it will just look like a mound of earth. And these are the sort of deeper sort of geologic disposal type things. And this is the finish concept. Go on. So deep geologic disposal, the idea is you do this for radioactive waste that contains radionuclides with very long half-lives. So you're trying to protect people for a long time scale. So you put it deep down in stable geologic formations. You know those formations have been stable for 1 million years. So that's good news. So that's where you put the waste. And you're not intending to retrieve it. So what you've got is basically you operate your disposal site, you then close it, you then have, I know I've overrun, but I'm nearly there. You then close it, you then have a period of monitoring, they call it oversight. I hate this American word, it's just so confusing, but basically you're looking after it, and then at some point these records or whatever may disappear, may be forgotten, people may have moved on, and then you're into the distant future, where how do you preserve the memory of the site? Do you want to preserve the memory of the site? Good question. Okay. So this is my wonderful picture of timescales. So here we have the radioactive waste. This is high-level waste. This is the total amount. It's a measure of radiotoxicity, and this is the radiotoxicity of the ore that you started with. So after about 10,000 to maybe 100,000 years, you're back to what you started with. So you could say, well, that's a place where I should stop worrying about it. But you're still talking about 10,000 to 100,000 years. I can talk about those with ease because I do calculations, and my computer models will calculate anything out to hundreds of millions of years. What does it mean in reality? There's all sorts of things that you can sort of benchmark against and say, well, okay, 10,000 years. Well, that's probably the time of the next glaciation. But what's it in terms of history? That's when agriculture started. That's an awfully long time ago, guys. This is the scale that we're talking about. So I think that I find quite an a useful sort of chart of what has happened and what timescales we're really talking about. Okay. So here's your geologic repository underground. You could have what you know is going to happen is eventually the containers will corrode, the water will get in, and things will start to dissolve and migrate. But it will take a long time, and eventually it will get back up to the biosphere, to fields and whatever, somewhere. But the whole point of the calculations that I do is to demonstrate when it does that it's so dilute and it's so decayed that it's not a hazard or a risk to people. So it's perfectly safe. Next. But of course there is the problem that somebody could drill. This is a very deep borehole. And this is oil explanation. They could drill a deep drill in and actually go into the repository. And there's a faint possibility of it. It's not terribly likely, but there is that chance. And if they do, then don't really want to be drilling into radioactive waste. Okay. So what can you do? You can basically you've got to try and reduce the probability of it happening. And this is where I think the records and markers and keeping knowledge alive is something that at least you can try to do. You can't guarantee it will happen, but you can try to do it. Okay, carry on. So, there is always this question, will people understand the mark? This is the new radiation warning trefoil. It's got the trefoil in the top, it's got a man running away and a picture of a skull. So, please can you get the hint that this is not good for you? But, will people understand this? I don't know. And obviously, would it be ignored or would it attract people because, oh, it says, oh, hey, there's something here, I'll go and have a look. Right, okay, carry on. And these are some of the signs that people have suggested in the past. Just flick through. That's it. You know, this is sort of very standard. There are all sorts of crazy ideas which I'm not going to be taking forward. Okay. But on the other hand, maybe you shouldn't even bother to mark them because, carry on, there are a number of important sites that weren't discovered because they weren't marked. And maybe that's a better thing. Okay. So, again, you've got to get your balance. This is an unlikely thing, but on the other hand, it might happen, and if you can do something to reduce the probability, then that's fairly straightforward, and then you should. Okay. So, my point is there's lots of information out there. There's lots of records. Actually getting your brain around all these records, you know that nuclear archive is going to have kilometres of it. Well, how's anybody going to understand that? Maybe there is a place for a different type of representation of the knowledge. And trying to remember that there was a nuclear era, if we give it up, we might not. But also trying to remember that there is a waste repository there. How do you encourage people to remember that? And I'm sure there are ways, I think there are ways in which artists can try and get this sort of knowledge of nuclear into just mainstream art, not necessarily art, but I'm just sort of thinking we know a lot about what used to happen in the past just through artists' paintings and things like that of situations, and it just reminds people. So, and there is a Constructing Memory conference, which is all about this, which is happening in September, which I'm sure is relevant or of interest to some people here. There you go. Sorry, it was overrun a bit.